according to the Civil Rights Act of '64, that's the basic federal law here, it's not discrimination for a faith group to hire based on faith, although they are subject to the other requirements, like no discrimination based on race or national origin, sex, and so on, because those are irrelevant to its religious character, was the idea. So, but religion's relevant to what they are, and so when the Congress decided to legislate, they never had before, that they ought to make an exception for faith groups. So I think the faith groups see it as, like a Democratic senator hires Democrats for his or her office, and environmental groups hire environmentally sensitive people, and so on. And they say, hey, we're a faith group. It's faith that motivates us, defines us. We do activities based on faith. We don't press it on anybody else, but that's the way we motivate ourselves. It's how we take our guidance. So we're looking for people who share that faith. And faith groups do this in very different kinds of ways. As you know, some of them, it's a very explicit requirement. Sometimes it's very informal. Sometimes groups hire from their own network, partly because they know those are people who are like them and have the same values, and that's what they're looking for. But basically, these faith groups are looking for an opportunity to have a staff that's committed to what their mission is. So it's perfectly legal under federal, state, local law for them to do that. Then the question is, what happens if they take government money? Well, most of the time, it is not illegal. It's not considered by the law discrimination for them to take government money and continue their hiring practices. So the fight is actually not over are they subject to the law, because they are subject to whatever the law is, which in many cases makes this exception for them. The question is, should that exception be allowed to continue? One of the big themes of the faith-based initiative, following on court decisions, Supreme Court decisions, was to say that groups ought not to be made ineligible unless there's a really good reason. And the fact that they're very religious and have religious practices isn't a sufficient reason. So the way the Supreme Court has said is that if you take that public money and use it for a wrong purpose, then you shouldn't be able to come to the table, asked to be a contractor or grantee. But if you're going to serve people the way we're asking and not press your faith on them, not discriminate because they're of a different faith, something like that, then you have perfectly right to come to the table. Well, if that's the case, I think a lot of groups just feel like here we have the right to take account of this critical characteristic, in our view, of employment. And now you're saying, but that's something you have to leave aside when everybody else can come to the table with their practices. So I think that's one side of it. Another side is just very practical. I think nobody knows the extent of faith groups that have been long-time partners with the government that hire based on faith. But I know it's very, very large. And I've been in rooms where officials from these organizations have talked to officials of the federal government and said, we know what your principle is, we know you're not trying to target us, but you think it's just wrong to hire based on faith if you get government money. But we've been your partners for decades, and we just want to tell you that if you change a policy, we have to walk away. Because what's really critical to us is to maintain a particular faith commitment. That's our tie to our donors. It's how we do things. It's what we bring to the table. It's how we motivate people. It's how we deal with crises. All those things. And some of those conversations, they're very, very fraught with energy because there's a principle there. There's also a principle of effective service that's been going on for decades. And so I think we don't know how extensive it is, but it's very broad, and so a lot of long-term relationships would be disrupted. One thing this does is pit institutional right against the individual right, and we're all very empathetic about the individual and that person who is looking for a place to serve. They find this a good place, or they haven't found any other job, and they'd like to serve there, and they're a perfectly good person, but the organization doesn't think they're competent for it because of their faith, and of course that's troubling to them. But you think about it the other way around. If the organization can't have that boundary, it's hard to think that it would have much of a faith content over time. So I think for that reason, it is a concern for these executives, but in different ways. And as I said, in some cases it's very informal, the hiring practice. And basically by hiring from their own networks, they assure that these are folks who are of the same mind, as it were. But in other cases, it's quite explicit. And as these topics have become more volatile, I think some groups have decided they have to be more explicit. In some ways that irritates people even more, but probably legally it's an important thing for them to do. There's been a long history here. You know, some people say all this started with Bush, but that's just really not the case. Sitting inside of government, looking at these long-term partnerships and realizing that many of them are with faith groups that perfectly legally took account of faith. Many of them are household names. And are you really prepared to turn all that upside down? Is that really something that you can do, should do, dare to do? I think all those questions must be preoccupying people to some extent. Case-by-case review, I think that's one way to say we're looking at it. I'm not sure entirely what that means. You know, if a faith group takes federal funds and hires based on religion and it's illegal, then it's just illegal. And if it's not illegal, it's just not illegal. So I'm not sure where the case-by-case comes. But if that means looking at it seriously and not just sloganeering, you know, that's a positive thing to do. I do think that a number of people have had to rethink all of this as they have realized that this wasn't some new thing that was started in the last 8 years, but has been a long-standing practice, even if it wasn't so visible to a lot of people. And then what do we do with it then? It's not that we just say, well, fine, if you want to walk away, because this implicates, you know, billions of dollars and big volume of services. We make choices all the time. And the question is, should those be allowed? Are they appropriate? Are they not appropriate? And again, in this case, when there's no government money involved, the Congress, the courts, policymakers, most people say, well, it makes sense to us that this organization, they're religious, they want to take account of that when they hire people. Makes sense to us just like it makes sense for a legislator to hire people of his or her own party. Okay, so in other words, we're saying that's not irrational, it's not just based on bias, it relates to the purpose of the organization. It's a reasonable thing to do. Well, now they're going to take public funds. Well, does it all of a sudden become unreasonable for them to do it? You may say they shouldn't do it because for some other reason, but it hasn't changed the character of the act of why they're doing it. So to call it discrimination, I think it cuts off thinking about it rather than helping us think better about it. And it could well be at the end of the day, there'll just be deep differences between people about this. So is this a freedom that a group ought to have or just not ought to have? And if they cannot have it, then I think you have to ask, you know, if a group can't, based on philosophy, conviction, religion, set up a boundary, will we have diverse groups that way or not? I just think they'll have to disappear over time, except to the extent that informally the same thing is done. So I think I would not like to see us go in that direction of just saying, you know, you can't make these choices.